It is 14 degrees on a January night in Kansas City, and under an overpass near the Blue River, a man who served 2 tours and can't hold a job because of what he saw is trying to sleep sitting up, because lying flat makes the nightmares worse. 4 miles away, behind a locked door in a 240-square-foot house with his name on the mailbox, a veteran we'll call Marcus is lying flat on purpose, because for the first time in 3 years, lying flat doesn't feel like surrender. His house cost less to build than most Americans spend on a kitchen renovation. It sits on a plot of land the city sold for $500. And what actually happens inside it, the parts that make it work, and the parts that almost killed the whole idea before it started, has nothing to do with charity in the way most people picture charity. To understand how a $500 empty lot became the flagship site of the largest network of tiny home villages for homeless veterans in the country, you have to go back to 2016 to a handful of combat veterans in Kansas City who were working day jobs at existing veteran nonprofits and hating almost everything about how those nonprofits operated. Chris Stout, an Army veteran, Mark Solomon, a Navy reservist, and Brian Meyer, an attorney and former Marine Corps corporal who'd done 2 tours in Iraq, kept running into the same wall. The programs meant to help homeless veterans were boxed in by grant restrictions and contract rules that decided, on a spreadsheet somewhere, which veterans were allowed to receive which kind of help. Meyer has described the moment plainly. They were tired of telling veterans no because of a line item. So the group quit their jobs and pooled what they had. They found 5 acres from the Kansas City Land Bank, an empty lot squeezed between a storage facility and a row of apartments and duplexes, and bought it for $500. Then reality hit. The lot had no sewer line, and when they went to the surrounding community to explain what they wanted to build, Meyer remembers being asked, more or less to his face, whether they were just planning to dump homeless men and women in shacks on the site. They built anyway. The first homes went up designed less like charity shelters and more like something a veteran would actually trust. 240 square feet, laid out with what the organization now calls PTSD informed design. The bed sits against the back wall, so a resident can see the entire room from where he sleeps. No blind corners, no surprises. The windows are deliberately offset so no one can see straight into a neighbor's home. The walls are thickly insulated, not for energy efficiency, but for quiet. Officially, the organization just calls it VCP Village. Nobody bothered inventing a nickname, because the residents settled on something simpler almost immediately. They call it home. So what does a morning actually look like inside one of these houses? Residents describe waking up to real silence, which sounds like a small thing until you've spent years sleeping with one ear open for footsteps. The insulation swallows the sound of the highway and the neighbors both. Marine Corps veteran Kyle Hansen, who lived in one of the tiny homes for 18 months starting in 2018, put it simply. The project gave him the space and time to identify and understand the challenges that had been holding him back. That's the quiet, unglamorous engine of the whole place. Not a miracle, just enough stillness to finally think. But stillness comes with its own strange adjustments nobody warns a new resident about. A 240-square-foot house has almost no wasted space, which means the smallest habits change first. Where you put your shoes, how you fold a blanket, learning to live in a footprint smaller than most people's bedroom. Some residents say the hardest week isn't the first night outside the shelter system. It's the first week inside a house this small, relearning how a human body moves through a room. The layout that was designed to prevent panic, no blind corners, full sight lines, can also make a home feel like it's watching you back. And living surrounded by dozens of other veterans, in homes that intentionally echo military barracks, cuts two ways at once. For some residents, that proximity is the whole point, the camaraderie they lost the day they took off the uniform. For others, especially those still raw from combat, being surrounded by that same structure, that same chain of command rhythm of case, managers and check-ins, can feel less like healing and more like never actually leaving. There is a negative logistical reality worth saying plainly, because the news cameras rarely linger on it. This isn't permanent housing. The average stay across the program is 335 days. Every resident knows from the day they move in that the tiny house is a launching pad, not a destination. And for some veterans, that clock quietly ticking in the background is its own kind of pressure. A full day in the village has a rhythm that surprises people who assume it's just a nicer campground. Mornings start early, often with a case manager meeting, because every resident is paired one-on-one with a caseworker the moment they arrive. This isn't a shelter where you're one of 100 names on a clipboard. Late mornings might mean a shuttle to a VA appointment, or a stop at the 3,000 square foot community center for a class on budgeting or job applications. Afternoons are quieter. Army veteran Aman, another resident, spends his in the community garden. That garden is my sanctuary outside of the sanctuary of my tiny home, he said. I get out there, feel the morning dew, smell the flowers and tomato vines, hear the buzzing bees. That's like therapy for me. Evenings bring the courtyard to life, a fire pit, picnic tables, a gazebo. Veterans who spent years avoiding crowds slowly learning to sit in one again. By night, the village goes quiet fast, because most of these men and women are exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with the day's schedule, and everything to do with finally being safe enough to feel tired. Only honorably discharged veterans experiencing homelessness are eligible, and every single one gets that same one-on-one case manager for the length of their stay, coordinating everything from VA disability claims to job placement to mental health care. The organization doesn't publish this as marketing copy, but the outcome numbers are real. An 85% success rate moving veterans out of the program and into permanent housing, against an industry standard usually cited around 30 to 40%. Marine Corps veteran Christopher Perry summed up the decade before he found VCP in 4 words: prison, drugs, homelessness, alcohol, and he's now enrolled in community college. That's the tricolon this place is quietly built around, whether anyone there would phrase it that way or not. A veteran with a locked door, a caseworker, and a stable address shows up different to a court date, different to a job interview, different to his own kids. So, if the model works this well, why isn't the whole country covered in these villages already? The honest answer isn't crime, and it isn't the program failing. It's arithmetic. Even now, with 6 full villages running and a 7th under construction, the entire national network totals somewhere around 240 completed tiny homes. The organization served roughly 1,000 veterans through its programs in 2025 alone, which sounds significant until you remember that on any given night, tens of thousands of veterans nationwide have nowhere to sleep. Every new village requires its own land deal, its own city council vote, its own multi-million-dollar capital campaign, one city at a time. The newest site, approved in Dallas in May of 2026, needs the organization to raise $15 million, with a hard deadline of $4 million by December 31st, 2027, or it loses the land entirely. The model isn't the bottleneck, the fundraising math is. But the idea didn't stay stuck in Kansas City, and it didn't collapse under that math either. It spread anyway. After that first village proved itself, VCP opened a second in Longmont, Colorado, 26 homes, where the local executive director put the whole philosophy into one sentence. It's about what's possible when veterans are given something many of us take for granted: privacy, dignity, and a door they can close. But it's the support behind that door, case management, trust, and community, that really changes lives. St. Louis followed with 50 homes after the organization had to fight through a zoning code that didn't even have a category for a tiny house village, eventually winning a special planned unit development permit to make it legal. Sioux Falls opened 25 homes. Glendale, Arizona opened 50. Milwaukee became the 6th village, and Good News Network ran resident testimony under the headline, "This place saved me." Now, Dallas is set to become the 7th on 7.33 acres of city land, directly across the street from the Dallas VA Medical Center and next to a light rail stop deliberately positioned so healthcare, transportation, and job access stop being obstacles. What started as 3 frustrated veterans and an empty lot with no sewer line is now, a decade later, a 7-city operation that's helped push the national homeless veteran population down by more than half since 2010. Before we get to who actually lives in these houses today, I want to pause for the people watching this who aren't just curious about the story. Some of you are one missed paycheck away from this. Some of you have a father, a brother, or a neighbor sleeping in a car tonight. And a heartbreaking number of the people who end up outside are veterans. On any given night, tens of thousands of American veterans sleep without a home. So, what do the veterans who've actually lived behind these doors say once the film crews leave? Almost everyone circles back to the same 3 things, and none of them is the house itself. The first is structure. A caseworker who calls you by name and expects you to show up, which after years of nobody expecting anything from you at all, turns out to matter more than people assume. The second is privacy. A door that locks in a system built almost entirely around shared rooms and shared bathrooms and shared everything. The third is smaller and harder to explain, something closer to what Aman meant about his garden, a reason to walk outside in the morning. Not a job yet, not a diagnosis solved, just one small living thing that needs him to show up. It also matters who's actually behind these doors, because the picture most people carry around is out of date. The stereotype is a young veteran fresh off a deployment. The data says otherwise. About half of all homeless veterans in America are 51 or older, and the 55 to 64 age bracket alone makes up nearly 38% of the entire homeless veteran population. Vietnam-era and early post-Vietnam veterans who fell through the cracks decades ago and never fully climbed back out. These are men well into their 60s who've been cycling through shelters, campgrounds, and relatives' couches since before some of VCP's own case managers were born. For this generation, the tiny home villages aren't a hip housing trend. They're often the first genuinely quiet, genuinely private space these men have had since before most of their case managers were born. It would be dishonest to leave out the criticism, and some of it is fair. The charity watchdog group Charity Watch has flagged Veterans Community Project not for how it spends money, but for how little it explains about how it spends money. The organization doesn't post audited financial statements publicly and hasn't consistently responded to disclosure requests. Its 2021 tax filing also showed a board-approved loan from the organization to CEO Brian Meyer with an original balance of $44,600. None of that is nothing, and donors deserve to know it. Broader critics of the whole tiny home village model raise a separate point. Transitional housing with an average 335-day stay isn't permanent housing, and some worry it lets cities feel like they've solved something without building the deeper, more expensive permanent housing stock the crisis actually requires. Both criticisms deserve to stand, but set against them is a number that's hard to argue with. An 85% rate of veterans successfully transitioning into permanent housing, more than double the typical industry outcome. At an organization, Charity Watch itself still rates an A for financial efficiency, with 80% of every dollar going straight to programs. A transitional home with a locked door and a caseworker, it turns out, costs the public far less than the alternative. The emergency rooms, the jail nights, the ambulance calls that come from leaving a veteran on the sidewalk instead. On a quiet afternoon, none of this looks like a policy debate at all. It looks like a man on his knees in the community garden, hands in the dirt, arguing cheerfully with another resident about whether the tomatoes need more water. It looks like two veterans fixing a gate hinge together, because one of them used to be a mechanic and the other used to be lonely. One resident, asked what the village actually gave him, didn't mention the walls or the roof at all. He said it gave him somewhere to be a person again, quietly, without an audience. So picture Marcus again, lying flat in his 240-square-foot house, while, 4 miles away, the man under the overpass is still sitting up against the cold. Marcus's house has no granite countertops and no guest room. What it has is a caseworker who knows his name, a door only he can lock, and a patch of garden 50 feet away that needs him tomorrow morning, whether he feels like showing up or not. 3 combat veterans bought the ground it sits on for $500, less than a decent set of tires, and built something on it that the VA's own numbers say works better than almost anything else tried in the last 15 years. That's the real thesis sitting underneath all of it. The distance between a man freezing under a bridge and a man sleeping flat on his back isn't a fortune. Sometimes it's a $500 lot, a caseworker with a clipboard, and one door that finally locks from the inside. And if you want more true stories about ordinary people quietly solving problems the country's been stuck on for decades, subscribe, because next week we're going inside the first apartment complex in America built entirely out of shipping containers for homeless veterans. And the strange reason a stranded pit bull tied outside a fire station is the whole reason it exists for at least one man who lives there now.